The bell above Meredith's bakery jingled as Ellie Nakamura flipped the sign to open, just as she had every morning since her grandmother's hospitalization 3 weeks ago. The familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon enveloped her as she moved through the small shop, running her fingers along the glass display cases her grandmother had polished religiously for 30 years. Just until she's back on her feet, Ellie muttered to herself, straightening the vintage cash register. Her biochemistry dissertation wasn't going to write itself, but family came first. That's what Grandma Meredith had always taught her. The morning rush came and went, regulars who asked about Meredith's health with genuine concern, tourists attracted by the bakery's reputation for out-of-this-world pastries. By noon, Ellie had settled into the comfortable rhythm of the day, her mind drifting to complex molecular structures rather than cookie dough. The bell jingled again. Ellie looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright midday sun. As the door closed, she could make out a woman with striking silver hair despite her youthful appearance, wearing an oddly structured suit that seemed to shimmer under the bakery lights. "Welcome to Meredith's," Ellie said automatically. "What can I get for you today?" The woman approached slowly, her eyes, an unusual violet shade Ellie initially attributed to colored contacts, scanning the shop methodically. "I was told I could find Meredith Nakamura here. Is she available?" "I'm sorry, my grandmother is in the hospital. I'm running the shop until she recovers." Ellie's voice caught slightly. The doctors weren't optimistic about recovery at Meredith's age. "Hospital?" The woman frowned. "I see. That is, unfortunate timing." Something about the woman's cadence struck Ellie as unusual, perfectly grammatical but slightly off, like someone speaking a non-native language they'd studied extensively. "Are you a friend of my grandmother's?" Ellie asked, curiosity piqued. "Not exactly." The woman approached the counter. "My name is Lyra. Your grandmother and I share a homeland. I've traveled quite far to speak with her about a matter of some urgency." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Homeland? Grandma's from Kyoto originally." Lyra's lips formed a thin smile. "Is that what she told you?" Before Ellie could respond, Lyra reached into her shimmering jacket and removed a small object that caught the light. It was a brooch identical to the one Grandma Meredith always wore, a swirling pattern that resembled galaxies colliding, crafted from a material Ellie had never been able to identify. "Where did you get that?" Ellie demanded. "It's a family crest, you might say. Your grandmother has one identical to this, doesn't she?" Ellie nodded slowly. "She never takes it off. Said it was the only thing she brought with her when she came to America." "From Japan?" Lyra's violet eyes seemed to intensify. "That's what she always said." But even as Ellie spoke, memories surfaced, strange comments her grandmother had made over the years, her peculiar knowledge of astronomy, the recipes that required ingredients Ellie had never found in any market. Lyra placed her palm flat on the counter. "Your grandmother's condition. Would it happen to involve her cellular structure breaking down in ways your doctors cannot explain?" Ellie stared. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because it's happening to all of us who've spent too long away from home." "But Meredith, she found something. A solution. That's why I'm here." "What are you talking about? What home?" Lyra's gaze shifted to the ceiling and beyond. "Your grandmother isn't from Kyoto, Ellie. She's not from this planet at all. And if what we've discovered is correct, neither are you, at least not entirely." The words hung in the air between them. Ellie's first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss this silver-haired stranger as delusional. But the brooch and the doctor's bafflement at her grandmother's condition. "That's ridiculous," Ellie said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Lyra countered. "Your grandmother's special recipes, the ones customers claim taste like nothing on earth, have you ever wondered how she creates flavors no one else can replicate?" A memory flashed in Ellie's mind, standing on a stool beside her grandmother at age 7, watching her sprinkle a shimmering powder into cookie dough. "My secret ingredient," Grandma had whispered, tapping Ellie's nose. "Starlight dust. One day, I'll show you where to find it." "This is insane," Ellie whispered. "The woman who raised you crossed galaxies to protect you," Lyra continued. "She encoded crucial scientific knowledge into her recipes, knowledge that could save our world and potentially extend her life. We need those formulas, Ellie." Ellie gripped the counter. "Even if what you're saying were true, which it isn't, I wouldn't know the first thing about finding whatever you're looking for." "The recipes," Lyra said simply. "They contain mathematical equations disguised as measurements and preparation methods. Your grandmother was our most brilliant physicist before her exile." "Exile?" Despite her skepticism, Ellie couldn't help but be drawn into the narrative. "Political disagreements," Lyra waved dismissively. "Ancient history now. What matters is that Meredith's work could save countless lives, including her own." The bakery door jingled again. A group of tourists entered, chattering excitedly about the famous, cosmic crumble, cookies. "I need to see your grandmother," Lyra said urgently. "And I need access to her complete recipe collection." Ellie's scientific mind warred with the impossibility of Lyra's claims. "I close at 6. Meet me here, and we'll talk more. That's all I'm promising." Lyra nodded, relief visible in her strange eyes. 6, then." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Ellie? Ask your grandmother about Celestria when you see her. Watch her reaction." As Lyra disappeared into the bright afternoon, Ellie felt the foundations of her reality begin to crack. Aliens. Exile. Secret formulas baked into cookies. It was completely absurd. And yet, as she mechanically served the waiting customers, a part of her wondered if it might explain why she'd always felt slightly out of step with the world around her, why she could intuitively grasp scientific concepts that baffled her professors, why she sometimes dreamed of skies filled with twin moons. Celestria, she whispered to herself, testing the word on her tongue. It sounded strangely like home. 3 days after Lyra's appearance, Ellie stood alone in her grandmother's silent apartment, clutching a cardboard box of personal effects. The hospital call had come at 2:17 that morning, too late for goodbyes, too early for proper grief. She was at peace, the night nurse had assured her. "And she left something for you." Now, Ellie placed the box on Meredith's kitchen counter, the same counter where they'd baked together since Ellie was tall enough to reach it. The apartment smelled of cardamom and something undefinable that Ellie had always associated with her grandmother, slightly metallic, faintly sweet, like nothing else on earth. The thought stopped her. Like nothing else on earth. She hadn't gone to meet Lyra that evening. Instead, she'd rushed to the hospital, bursting into her grandmother's room with questions ready. But Meredith had been sleeping, her frail chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital blanket, and Ellie couldn't bring herself to wake her. The next day, her grandmother had been too disoriented for conversation, and by the third day, Ellie wiped away tears with the back of her hand. Grieving could wait. First, she needed answers. She opened the box carefully. On top lay Meredith's ever-present brooch, the swirling galaxy pattern catching the light just as Lyra's had done. Beneath it was a letter in her grandmother's elegant script, the characters slightly shaky from illness. "My dearest Ellie. If you're reading this, then I've returned to the stars. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was there to answer your questions. Earth has been my home for 60 years, but I was born under different skies, on a world called Celestria." Ellie's hands trembled. Celestria, the word Lyra had mentioned. "Your grandfather never knew my origins, it was safer that way. But you, my brilliant granddaughter, have always been special. The way you see patterns in chemistry, your intuitive understanding of quantum physics, these are not coincidences. They are your heritage. Beneath this letter lies my true legacy, my research and my recipes, which are one and the same. What looks like baking instructions to human eyes contains molecular formulas and quantum calculations that could save my homeworld from collapse. I encoded my research this way to protect it from those who would use it destructively. Trust Lyra. She was once my student, and while we had our differences, her heart is true. She will help you understand. The knowledge is yours now. Use it wisely, my starlight. All my love across the cosmos. Grandma Meredith. Ellie set the letter down, heart pounding. Beneath it lay a worn leather-bound book, its cover etched with the same swirling pattern as the brooch. With shaking fingers, she opened it. The pages were filled with recipes, written in her grandmother's handwriting, some familiar, others she'd never seen before. But as she flipped through, she noticed odd notations in the margins, ingredients she'd never heard of, temperature settings that seemed impossibly precise, and timing instructions that referenced astronomical events. Starlight cookies, she read aloud, finding the recipe for her grandmother's most famous creation. The ingredient list was bizarre. Asterisk, 2½ cups sifted quantum flour, processed under waxing binary stars. 3/4 cup crystallized temporal sugar. 2 eggs from Earth chickens, adequate substitution for Celestrian avians. 1 teaspoon vanilla extract. 1/2 teaspoon salt, NaCl, Earth standard. 1 tablespoon pulverized nebula dust, from personal reserve, asterisk. The preparation instructions were equally strange, containing references to molecular alignment and gravitational constants. At the bottom of the recipe, in smaller writing, when properly prepared, equations embedded in sugar crystallization patterns will reveal phase shift stabilization matrix. Ellie closed the book, overwhelmed. It was real. All of it. Her grandmother, this kind, cookie-baking woman who'd taught her to ride a bike and bandaged her scraped knees, had been an alien scientist in hiding. Which made Ellie. What, exactly? Half alien? Quarter alien? Was that even possible? She opened the recipe book again, determined now. The final pages contained diagrams of molecular structures that looked similar to her dissertation research on protein folding. In fact, if she wasn't mistaken, some of these structures might explain why certain compounds she'd been working with behaved unpredictably under specific conditions. A sudden realization hit her. Her grandmother had been subtly guiding her research all along. Ellie flipped back to the Starlight cookies recipe. She couldn't procure nebula dust or quantum flour, but perhaps she could substitute with earthly ingredients that might approximate the needed molecular structures. Her biochemistry knowledge combined with her grandmother's baking lessons might be enough to at least attempt a version of the recipe. She gathered what supplies she could from her grandmother's kitchen, noting that some of the spice jars had unusual labels with those same strange symbols from the recipe book. As she worked, mixing and measuring, she felt an unusual energy building in her fingertips, a tingling sensation unlike anything she'd experienced before. When she added a pinch of a shimmering powder labeled only with a star symbol, the entire mixture began to emit a faint bluish glow. That's definitely not normal, Ellie muttered, but continued following the recipe. As she placed the cookies in the oven, the brooch, which she'd pinned to her shirt, suddenly warmed against her chest. The swirling pattern seemed to move, shifting and realigning itself into a new configuration. Ellie stared at it, transfixed. It wasn't just a brooch. It was technology of some kind. When the oven timer dinged, the cookies that emerged weren't just glowing slightly, they were emitting patterns of light that shifted and changed as they cooled. And within those patterns, Ellie could somehow see mathematical equations forming, complex formulas that her mind could follow despite having never seen their like before. The doorbell rang, startling her from her trance-like state. Through the peephole, she saw Lyra standing in the hallway, now accompanied by a tall man with the same unusual violet eyes. We felt the energy signature, Lyra said when Ellie opened the door. Meredith's formulas have been activated. My grandmother is dead, Ellie said flatly. Sorrow crossed Lyra's face. We feared as much when the anchor signal weakened. I'm truly sorry, Ellie. She left me a letter. And this. Ellie gestured to the recipe book. She said to trust you. And the activation? You've already begun experimenting? Lyra looked toward the kitchen, where the cookies continued to emit their strange, pulsing light. I just wanted to try, Ellie began. You've done more than try, the man beside Lyra interrupted. You've successfully initialized the quantum entanglement sequence. Something not even our most skilled scientists could accomplish with Meredith's formulas. I just followed a cookie recipe, Ellie protested. Lyra and her companion exchanged meaningful glances. No, Ellie, Lyra said gently. You've just taken the first step toward saving a planet. And possibly changing the fate of 2 worlds. As if responding to her words, the cookies on the cooling rack pulsed once, brilliantly, before settling into a steady, star-like glow. Ellie stared at the strange gathering in her grandmother's living room. Over the 3 days following her baking experiment, Lyra's 2 associates had become 6, then 12, all with those distinctive violet eyes in varying shades, all with that same formal, slightly off-kilter way of speaking. Let me get this straight, Ellie said, pacing between the couch and the window. My grandmother was a physicist from a planet called Celestria who was exiled 60 years ago for political reasons. She encoded her research into baking recipes, and now you need this research because your planet is dying. An accurate summation, said Kieran, the tall man who had accompanied Lyra that first night. He appeared to be their group's scientific lead. Though I would clarify that Meredith's exile was self-imposed. She chose to leave rather than work on the applications our government demanded. Weapons, Lyra added softly. They wanted to weaponize her research on dimensional phasing. And now? Ellie asked. Now we face extinction, said an older woman named Tavin. Her silver hair was styled in an elaborate pattern that seemed to defy gravity. The dimensional instability Meredith predicted has accelerated. Celestria exists in a pocket dimension that's collapsing. Without her research, we cannot stabilize it. Ellie glanced at the kitchen where her grandmother's recipe book lay open. For the past 3 days, she'd been working with Kieran and Lyra to decipher more of the recipes, each one revealing complex equations disguised as baking instructions. And these cookies I made, they're what, exactly? Ellie gestured to the original starlight cookies, still glowing faintly under a glass dome. A quantum beacon, Kieran explained. The specific molecular arrangement creates a stable anchor point between dimensions. It's remarkable that you were able to activate it with Earth ingredients. I substituted based on molecular structures, Ellie said with a shrug that belied her pride. My dissertation is on protein folding patterns. It wasn't that different. The Celestrians exchanged glances that Ellie was learning to recognize as their equivalent of impressed surprise. That you made these connections intuitively confirms what we suspected, Lyra said. Your hybrid physiology gives you unique insights. Hybrid. The word still unsettled Ellie. According to the Celestrians, while her grandfather had been fully human, her father, Meredith's son, had been born with mixed heritage, though he'd never known it. He and Ellie's mother had died in a car accident when Ellie was 4, leaving Meredith to raise her. Had my father known about this? Ellie asked, not for the first time. About who he really was? Tavin shook her head. Meredith was adamant about protecting him from the truth. She feared that knowledge of his origins would make him a target. A target for what? There are elements on Celestria who would view any hybrid as a potential security breach, Kieran explained diplomatically. And elements on Earth who would view him as a research subject rather than a person. Ellie thought of government agencies and labs that would certainly take an unhealthy interest in proof of extraterrestrial life. Perhaps her grandmother's secrecy had been prudent. So why reveal everything now? Why come for these formulas after all this time? Because we're out of options, Lyra said simply. Our dimensional pocket has perhaps 6 months before total collapse. And because Meredith finally succeeded, added Tavin. The quantum beacon you've activated was her way of signaling that she'd solved the final equation. We've been monitoring for such a signal for decades. Ellie frowned. But I activated it, not her. Yes, Kieran said, sharing another of those meaningful glances with his companions. That is unexpected. By all our calculations, only Meredith should have been able to initialize the sequence correctly. Unless she deliberately calibrated it to respond to Ellie's biorhythms, suggested a younger Celestrian named Dax, who had been quiet until now. A failsafe. Lyra nodded slowly. That would be like Meredith, planning ahead, ensuring the research wouldn't die with her. A notification pinged on Kieran's wrist device, a sleek band that Ellie had initially mistaken for jewelry but now recognized as technology far beyond Earth's capabilities. The dimensional anchor is stabilizing, he announced, surprise evident in his voice. The beacon is working better than anticipated. That can't be right, Tavin said, moving to look at his readings. The full stabilization sequence requires all 5 anchor points. 5? Ellie interrupted. 5 what? 5 quantum beacons, Lyra explained. According to Meredith's earlier communications, her solution required 5 precisely calibrated anchor points to create a pentagonal stability field around Celestria. Like 5 stakes to hold a tent in place, Dax offered helpfully, noting Ellie's confusion. And we've only activated 1, Ellie concluded. Yes, but it's holding with unexpected strength, Kieran said, still studying his device. Almost as if. A blinding flash from the kitchen interrupted him. Ellie rushed toward it, the Celestrians close behind. The glass dome covering the starlight cookies had shattered, and the cookies themselves were now projecting a complex holographic display that rotated slowly above the counter. It's a stellar map, Tavin breathed. Those are Celestria's coordinates. And those, Kieran pointed to 5 pulsing points on the map, must be the locations for all 5 anchor points. Ellie stared at the map, recognition dawning. Those aren't just random locations. They correspond to places on Earth where my grandmother lived. That's Boston, where she first arrived. That's San Francisco, where she met my grandfather. That's Chicago, where my father was born. And that's here, in Portland. And the 5th? Lyra asked. Ellie pointed to the final pulsing light. Kyoto. Where she pretended to be from. She must have hidden something at each location, more recipes, more formulas. A security protocol, Kieran nodded approvingly. Distributing the research to prevent any single entity from claiming it all. But why Earth? Dax wondered. Why hide the anchors here instead of on Celestria? Because Earth exists outside our dimensional pocket, Tavin explained. If all anchors were within Celestria, they would collapse along with it. By placing them here, Meredith created external stability points. Clever, Lyra murmured. She wasn't just hiding from those who wanted her weapons research. She was positioning the solution where it would actually work. The holographic map suddenly pulsed more intensely, and a timer appeared, counting down from 144 hours. 6 days, Kieran translated. That's our window to activate all 5 anchor points before this one fails. And if it fails? Ellie asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Then Celestria falls into dimensional collapse, taking its 8 billion inhabitants with it, Tavin said grimly. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the situation sank in. 8 billion lives depending on recipes hidden across the globe by an exiled alien scientist who had disguised herself as a Japanese-American baker. We need to split up, Lyra finally said. Teams to each location. I'm going too, Ellie stated firmly. These are my grandmother's formulas, and apparently, I'm the only one who can activate them properly. It would be dangerous, Kieran warned. Your government agencies would take great interest if they detected our presence spreading globally. As if on cue, a dark sedan pulled up outside the apartment building, visible through the living room window. Two men in suits emerged, their movements precise and practiced. That's not a coincidence, Dax said nervously. Someone detected the energy signature from the beacon, Tavin concluded. We need to move. Now. Lyra turned to Ellie, her violet eyes intense. We need to leave immediately. Are you with us, Ellie? Once we begin this journey, there's no turning back. Ellie glanced around her grandmother's apartment, at the photos on the walls showing 3 generations of a family that was more extraordinary than she'd ever imagined, at the kitchen where cosmic secrets had been disguised as cookie recipes, at the life she'd thought she understood completely until just days ago. The doorbell rang, followed by a firm knock. Ms. Nakamura, a male voice called. This is Agent Henderson with the Department of Energy. We'd like to speak with you about some unusual readings from this location. Ellie made her decision. She grabbed the recipe book and her grandmother's brooch. 5 locations, 6 days, 8 billion lives, she said to Lyra. Let's go save your world. The basement of Meredith's bakery hummed with tension and possibility. 36 hours after their narrow escape from Kyoto, Ellie stood before her grandmother's original industrial mixer, now modified with components from Celestrian technology. The countdown on the holographic display showed less than 7 hours until dimensional collapse would reach critical mass. Final diagnostics check, Kieran announced, his usually composed voice tight with stress. Dimensional bridge matrices from all 4 activated beacons are holding but showing increasing strain patterns. Portland's energy grid is fluctuating, Agent Powell reported, eyes on a tablet displaying power consumption across the city. Your activities aren't going unnoticed. Neither is the evacuated 6-block radius around the bakery, Lyra added dryly. Your government's containment story about a gas leak will only hold for so long. Beyond the basement walls, a perimeter of United Nations Special Division agents maintained the exclusion zone while a select scientific team monitored the unprecedented dimensional phenomena. Powell had kept his word, convincing his superiors to grant the team this final chance based on the promising data from Kyoto. Ellie barely registered their conversation. Her focus remained fixed on her grandmother's last recipe, universal communion bread, spread open before her. This final formula was the most complex yet, requiring precise integration of all elements from the previous 4 beacons, plus several new components that had taken their remaining Celestrian colleagues around the globe to procure. Status on Celestria, she asked without looking up. Tavin, who maintained their tenuous communication link with the homeworld, shook her head grimly. Dimensional fissures have reached the capital city. 3 million more evacuated to emergency shelters in the outer provinces, but those pocket dimensions are destabilizing too. Dax entered the basement, carrying a small case with reverence. The final component arrived. Subspace courier from the Celestrian Science Ministry, they managed to extract it from the quantum archives before the building collapsed. Inside the case lay a tiny vial of swirling iridescent material that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The essence of Celestria itself, Lyra explained, seeing Ellie's questioning look. A distilled quantum signature of our world's unique dimensional properties. My grandmother's notes indicated something like this would be necessary, Ellie confirmed. The bridge needs to recognize both dimensional signatures to create proper alignment. As Ellie carefully incorporated the essence into the mixture, her hands moved with a confidence that still surprised her. In just 1 week, she had progressed from skeptical biochemistry student to someone who could manipulate quantum properties through molecular gastronomy, a skill set she hadn't known existed, much less that she possessed. "You know," she said conversationally, trying to ease the tension as she worked, "a week ago, my biggest worry was defending my dissertation. Now I'm baking interdimensional bread to save 2 planets." "Your grandmother would be proud," Lyra said softly. She always claimed her greatest discovery was finding that science and art were the same language spoken with different accents. "Speaking of language," Powell interjected, "our linguists and mathematicians are fascinated by the equations embedded in these recipes. The implications for theoretical physics alone. Let's ensure there's a world left to study them in," Kieran interrupted, checking a reading on his wrist device. "The dimensional pressure is increasing exponentially." Ellie completed the final preparations and carefully placed the specially prepared dough into the modified oven. Unlike her previous beacon activations, this one required precise temperature modulation over a specific time sequence. "And now we wait," she said, setting the timer for 42 minutes, a number that her grandmother's notes had emphasized repeatedly. The group fell into tense silence, each lost in their thoughts as the minutes ticked by. Through the small basement window, Ellie could see the sky taking on a strange, rippling quality, the first visible sign of dimensional instability reaching Earth. "When this works," she said, carefully choosing when over if what happens next. "To Celestria? To Earth?" Tavin and Kieran exchanged glances before Tavin answered. "According to Meredith's theoretical models, the 2 dimensions will align in parallel layers, separate but connected through stable transfer points. Like 2 sheets of paper touching at 5 points, but otherwise maintaining their independence." "And the people of each world?" Ellie pressed. "That," Powell said, "is where science ends and politics begins. Your governments will need to establish diplomatic protocols," Lyra acknowledged. "It won't be simple, but it's better than extinction." "And perhaps," Kieran added with unexpected optimism, 2 civilizations with complementary knowledge and technologies might solve problems neither could address alone." The timer chimed, startling everyone. Ellie approached the oven, feeling the weight of 2 worlds on her shoulders. As she opened the door, a wave of energy washed over them, not explosive but enveloping, like walking into a room filled with music. The bread inside had transformed into a luminous crystalline structure that pulsed with complex patterns of light and darkness. "It's beautiful," Dax whispered. "It's working," Kieran corrected, eyes fixed on his monitoring device. Dimensional alignment initiating at all 5 anchor points. "The bridge is forming." The basement began to shimmer as reality itself seemed to flex and stretch. Above them, the rippling sky visible through the window suddenly calmed, then flared with aurora-like colors that spread across the horizon. "Celestrian reports coming in," Tavin announced excitedly. "The fissures are stabilizing. Dimensional collapse has halted." Powell's tablet beeped with incoming messages. "Confirmation from our side too, the microfractures in Earth spacetime are sealing themselves. Whatever you've done, it's affecting both worlds positively." The crystalline bread structure suddenly rose from its pan, hovering in the center of the room. It expanded, revealing intricate geometric patterns that reminded Ellie of her grandmother's brooch design. Then it separated into 5 identical segments, each glowing with a different colored light. "The 5 anchors, unified," Lyra breathed. 4 of the segments vanished, presumably transporting themselves to the other beacon locations. The 5th remained, rotating slowly before them. "Final integration sequence," Kieran explained, checking his readings. "Any moment now." The crystal flared blindingly, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the basement appeared unchanged, except for a shimmering, door-sized rectangle of light hovering against the far wall. "A permanent transfer point," Tavin announced in awe. "A stable connection between Earth and Celestria." Lyra approached the portal cautiously, then reached out to touch its surface. Her hand passed through effortlessly. A moment later, a face appeared from the other side, an older Celestian with elaborate robes and an expression of profound relief. "Premier Vex," Lyra acknowledged with a formal bow. "The bridge is established. Meredith Nakamura's final work is complete. And we owe our continued existence to her, and to you all," the Celestian leader responded, his voice carrying a musical quality as it translated across dimensions. His violet eyes found Ellie. "Especially to you, granddaughter of Meredith. Your world and ours now stand at the threshold of a new era." Powell stepped forward, straightening his tie in what Ellie recognized as a nervous gesture. "Agent Marcus Powell, United Nations Special Division, Earth. I believe we have much to discuss, Premier." "Indeed we do," Vex agreed. "But first, a proper acknowledgement." He raised his hand in a formal gesture, and suddenly the portal widened, revealing a vast chamber beyond filled with Celestians. As one, they placed their hands over their hearts and bowed deeply toward Ellie. "The savior of two worlds deserves recognition from both," Vex said. "Ellie Nakamura, daughter of Earth and Celestia, you have fulfilled your grandmother's legacy beyond all expectations." Ellie felt emotions well up, grief for the grandmother she'd lost, wonder at the heritage she'd discovered, and possibilities stretching before her that no human had ever contemplated. "I just followed her recipes," she said simply. "And in doing so, you've written a new one," Lyra responded with a warm smile. "A recipe for coexistence." 6 months later. Meredith's Bakery, now officially designated Interdimensional Transfer Point Alpha, had become the most famous eatery in the galaxy. The line stretched around the block daily, a mix of humans eager to taste the now legendary, cosmic cuisine and Celestian visitors adjusting to Earth's atmosphere and customs. Inside, Ellie placed a fresh batch of Harmony macarons in the display case, a new recipe she developed that incorporated ingredients from both worlds, creating flavors that literally couldn't exist in either dimension independently. "The educational exchange delegation arrives at 2, Lyra reminded her, now officially serving as Celestia's first ambassador to Earth. "Premier Vex and Secretary General Okonjo will be expecting something special." "The probability pastries are almost ready," Ellie assured her. And Kieran's team finished installing the quantum projection system for the presentation. The basement laboratory, vastly expanded now, housed researchers from both worlds studying the unprecedented dimensional mechanics that Meredith's work had made possible. Already, their collaboration had yielded breakthroughs in medicine, energy generation, and environmental restoration. "Your grandmother's portrait arrived," Tavin announced, carefully unwrapping a painting commissioned by the Celestian Science Ministry. It depicted Meredith as Ellie had known her, kind eyes, flour-dusted apron, but with the swirling Celestian symbol proudly displayed on her collar and quantum equations subtly woven into the background. "Perfect," Ellie said, blinking back tears as they hung it in the place of honor above the original mixer, now preserved as a historical artifact. "She brought worlds together with food and science. I can't think of a better legacy." The portal in the corner of the bakery hummed with activity as passengers and goods moved between dimensions. Powell, now director of the UN Office of Interdimensional Affairs, emerged with a tablet in hand. "The Tokyo and Sydney transfer points are online," he reported. "That makes 5 total, with London and Cairo scheduled for next month." "A pentagon of connection points," Ellie noted. "Just like the beacon pattern." "Your grandmother really did think of everything," Lyra said, adjusting her now permanent Earth attire, though she'd kept her silver hair, as it had become something of a fashion trend among humans. Dax, who had chosen to remain on Earth as a cultural liaison, emerged from the kitchen with a tray of sample cookies for waiting customers. "These are popular," he announced upon returning. 3 humans asked for the recipe, and that visiting physicist from MIT wanted to know if the quantum alignment properties could be applied to his string theory research. "Tell him to talk to Kieran," Ellie suggested, smiling. "And remind him that proper science requires proper measurements," no estimating ingredients. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the bakery windows, it caught the crystalline display piece at the center of the main table, a replica of the final beacon bread, preserved in a state of perpetual dimensional harmony. Within its swirling patterns, one could glimpse, if they looked just right, reflections of both Earth and Celestria simultaneously existing in perfect balance. Ellie touched the brooch at her collar, her grandmother's original, now modified to serve as her official credentials as Director of Interdimensional Research. The swirling pattern seemed to ripple under her fingers, responding to her unique biology. Outside, a child's face pressed against the window, eyes wide with wonder at the tall, violet-eyed visitor sampling an Earth chocolate chip cookie for the first time. The visitor offered a piece to the child, a simple gesture of sharing across differences that had once seemed insurmountable. Cosmic crumbs, Ellie murmured to herself, watching the exchange. Bringing universes together, one cookie at a time. On the wall behind the counter, handwritten in both English and Celestrian script, hung her grandmother's most famous saying, now the unofficial motto of Earth-Celestria relations. The universe is wider than our fears and sweeter than our divisions. As Ellie prepared for the delegation's arrival, mixing ingredients from two worlds to create something entirely new, she knew her grandmother had been right all along. The best recipes, like the best solutions, brought different elements together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. And in that combination, anything was possible. For days, 3 continents, and 2 activated beacons later, Ellie crouched behind the counter of a small tea shop in Kyoto, her heart pounding in her ears. Outside, agents from multiple Earth governments converged, their communications crackling through the listening device Dax had rigged up. "They're calling for backup," Lyra whispered, her silver hair now dyed black in an attempt at disguise. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they breach the perimeter." "Status?" Ellie asked Kieran, who was carefully assembling ingredients on a worn wooden table that had once belonged to Ellie's great-grandmother, or so the cover story went. "Nearly complete," he replied, measuring a shimmering substance with precision that would impress the most demanding chemistry professor. "The molecular alignment is approaching optimal parameters." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. In the whirlwind days since leaving Portland, she'd proven herself invaluable to the mission. Her hybrid biology allowed her to intuitively understand her grandmother's cryptic recipes in ways pure Celestrians couldn't, while her human adaptability helped the team navigate Earth's cultures and security systems. In Boston, they'd found a safety deposit box containing vials of rare compounds and another recipe book, hidden under Meredith Nakamura's first Earth alias. The activation had gone smoothly, the quantum beacon establishing itself in an abandoned bakery basement. San Francisco had proven more challenging. The hiding place had been converted into a tech startup's headquarters, requiring an elaborate infiltration. But they'd succeeded, activating the third beacon just as federal agents had stormed the building. Chicago's beacon was already compromised, agents had found Meredith's old storage unit and removed its contents. A devastating setback, until Ellie had realized her grandmother's contingency. The formula itself had been incorporated into a public mural outside her father's childhood home, the molecular structures disguised as an artistic pattern. With Tavin's technology and Ellie's insight, they'd reconstructed the beacon from the mural alone. Now, in Kyoto, they faced their most dangerous activation yet, with authorities from multiple nations closing in, and only 2 days remaining before the dimensional collapse reached critical levels. "I was right about the transmissions," Dax said, looking up from his monitoring device. "They've detected our communications with Celestria. They know we're not human, well, not all of us." He glanced apologetically at Ellie. "Have they identified me specifically?" she asked. "Unclear," Tavin responded, her eyes on her own monitoring equipment. "But they've connected the energy signatures to your grandmother's identity. It's only a matter of time." Ellie felt the weight of her grandmother's brooch against her chest, now understanding that it was actually a sophisticated quantum computer, storing much of the core research. She'd learned to interface with it, unlocking abilities that still astonished her, seeing energy patterns, understanding complex physics intuitively, even limited communication with the Celestrians' homeworld. Through those communications, she'd witnessed firsthand the desperation of a dying planet. Dimensional fissures tore through Celestrian cities, temporal distortions devastated ecosystems, and millions had already been evacuated to temporary dimensional pockets that wouldn't last much longer. "It's ready," Kieran announced, stepping back from his work. The mixture in the bowl had taken on that now familiar luminescent quality, patterns of light shifting through it like conscious entities. "For down, one to go after this," Lyra said with cautious optimism. "If we can activate this one and reach Portland again for the final beacon, we might just save Celestria." "And what about Earth?" The question came from behind them. They turned to find a man in a tailored suit standing in the tea-room's back in trance, a gun held casually at his side. His stance screamed, "Government agent," but nothing identified which government. "I've been following your group since Chicago," he said calmly. "Impressive work with that mural." "Very clever." "Who are you?" Ellie demanded, instinctively moving between the agent and the nearly completed beacon formula. "Agent Marcus Powell, United Nations Special Division," he replied. "A division so special most UN members don't know it exists. We monitor potential extraterrestrial activity." "Then you know what's at stake," Lyra said. "A planet of 8 billion souls faces extinction." "I know what you've told Ms. Nakamura," Powell countered. "I also know that activating these beacons is creating unprecedented energy signatures across Earth. Energy signatures that are altering our planet's dimensional stability." Ellie felt a cold sensation spread through her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that saving Celestria might come at Earth's expense," Powell said bluntly. "Our scientists have detected microfractures in spacetime surrounding each activated beacon. They're contained for now, but they're growing." Kieran and Tavin exchanged alarmed glances. "Is this true?" Ellie asked them. After a moment's hesitation, Tavin nodded. "There is some dimensional displacement occurring around the anchor points. But it should be temporary. Once all 5 beacons are active and the stabilization matrix forms, the displacement should resolve." "Should," Powell emphasized. "You're gambling with my planet to save yours." "That's not what my grandmother intended," Ellie insisted, though doubt crept into her voice. "Her research was meant to save lives, not trade one world for another." "Perhaps," Powell agreed. "Or perhaps she didn't anticipate all consequences. Even geniuses make mistakes, especially when they're desperate." Ellie's mind raced. Could her grandmother have miscalculated? Or worse, had she known the potential cost to Earth but proceeded anyway out of loyalty to her homeworld? "We have company," Dax warned, his eyes on the monitoring device. "Multiple teams approaching from all directions." "You need to decide, Ms. Nakamura," Powell said. "Complete this beacon, and you might save Celestria while endangering Earth. Or stop now, and preserve Earth's dimensional stability while condemning Celestria." "There must be another way," Ellie insisted. "If there is, you have approximately 4 minutes to find it before this place is swarming with agents who won't be as conversational as I am," Powell replied. Ellie looked at the mixture on the table, so close to activation, then at the anxious faces of her Celestrian companions. In just days, they had become something like family, united by a desperate mission and her grandmother's legacy. "Ellie," Lyra said softly. "I won't tell you what to choose. But know that Meredith spent decades perfecting these formulas. She loved both worlds. I don't believe she would create a solution that sacrificed one for the other." Something clicked in Ellie's mind. "Both worlds," she repeated. "That's it." She was a hybrid thinker, Earth and Celestria together. Her solution wouldn't be either/or, it would integrate both perspectives. She yanked off the brooch and held it over the mixture. "The 5th ingredient in every recipe, the one she never specified amounts for, it was always to taste. What if that wasn't vague instructions but precise ones? What if the missing element is literally a part of her, of us? Without hesitation, she pricked her finger on the brooch's pin and let a single drop of her blood, human and Celestian combined, fall into the mixture. The reaction was immediate and unlike anything they'd seen before. Rather than forming a beacon projecting outward, the energy coalesced inward, creating a swirling miniature galaxy that hovered above the bowl. It's a dimensional bridge, Kieran breathed, astonished. Not just an anchor point, a permanent connection between dimensions. Meredith's true solution, Tavin realized. Not to reinforce Celestria's failing pocket dimension, but to transition it safely into alignment with Earth's dimension. Two worlds occupying different dimensional layers but existing in harmony, Lyra added, wonder in her voice. Will it work with just 4 beacons? Ellie asked. Kieran studied the readings on his device. The symmetry is imperfect, but the integration has begun. If we can place the 5th beacon in Portland and complete the geometric pattern, then both worlds survive, Ellie finished. She turned to Agent Powell. There's your other way. Not a conflict between planets, but a partnership. Powell looked skeptical but lowered his weapon slightly. Can you prove this won't harm Earth? Look at the readings yourself, Ellie offered her grandmother's brooch, now displaying holographic data. The dimensional stress is already redistributing, becoming more stable at all anchor points. As Powell studied the information, tactical chatter intensified on Dax's monitoring device. Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now, Dax warned. One condition, Powell said abruptly. I come with you to Portland. If at any point Earth's stability seems genuinely threatened, I pull the plug, and you let me. Ellie glanced at her Celestian companions, receiving subtle nods of agreement. Deal, she said, extending her hand. Now help us get out of here. We have one more cookie to bake, and a planet, no, 2 planets, depending on us. As sirens wailed outside and the first agents breached the tea house's front entrance, Ellie, the Celestians, and their unlikely new ally slipped through a service exit, the glowing dimensional bridge safely contained in Kieran's transport case. Behind them, confused agents found only an empty tea room, a lingering scent of vanilla, and a single fortune cookie on the counter. Inside it, a message in Meredith Nakamura's handwriting: the universe is wider than our fears and sweeter than our divisions.